Hello and welcome to the Battle for Container Security. We're joined by a rock star set of panelists today to talk about where container security is at the moment and where it's heading. Our guests include Pavan Shankar, who's the Director of Product Marketing for Sysdig Secure. Pavan, welcome.
Nice to have you. Thanks, Mike.
We also have Jeffrey Martin, who's the Associate Vice President of Product Management for WhiteSource. Jeffrey, welcome.
Hey, good to be here.
All right. We have Matt Jarvis, Senior Developer Advocate for Snyk. Matt, welcome.
Hi, folks. Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Daniel Hampton, Senior Technical Account Manager for Signal Sciences, which is now part of Fastly. Daniel, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
All right. We're going to have some gift cards today for everybody, so hang out to the very end to see who wins those. We also encourage you all to participate at any point. Find that Q&A button on your screen, ask any questions. If somebody says something that strikes your interest or you want to hear more, we'll ask them while we have them right here. All right, guys, let's get started. Jeffrey, we're going to start with you.
Okay, I'm sorry already. No, all right, what do we got?
The question I'm going to ask you is, do you perceive that applications that are containerized are more secure, less secure, or just completely differently insecure than traditional applications?
I like that phrasing, differently insecure. Look, fundamentally, I think we all understand that security is a spectrum, and it's just really the point you want to decide at your risk being mitigated versus not. And I think the same principles apply, container versus not. But if I had to pick one of those three options, it's differently insecure.
All right, Matt, what do you think? Are you on the same page with that?
I mean, I think it's a good question because, you know, we have to take into account that containers don't exist in a vacuum, right? I mean, almost everybody's running containers now. We're actually talking about these, you know, probably Kubernetes as the orchestration platform. We're talking about CI/CD systems. You know, we're talking about pipeline workflow. So there's a lot of moving parts in there, and you know, this is one of the problem spaces in cloud native security right now. I mean, I would say that done right, you know, then the cloud native container model can be extremely secure. But you know, done wrong, it's probably more insecure than running things on bare metal. So I think the risk of getting things wrong is the real challenge that we've got as an industry now, and there's lots and lots and lots of ways that you can get it very, very wrong.
All right. Daniel, is the problem the containers, or is it really what's hiding in the containers that's at issue? And those problems have been around for a while, so what's different?
You know, I think what's hiding in the containers is, you know, it's the same as anything else, right? An application is a piece of software. You got to secure the software. You got to treat it as insecure. Zero trust models work well to help us handle some of these things, but ultimately you can't mitigate a risk you're unaware of. And I think the concern with containers is a lot of people are ignorant about how the orchestration technology works. They think a container is a black box. We're not viewing a container as an operating system with software on it we're familiar with, and as such, we know how to secure it. A lot of the times, the customers that I'm dealing with they're very much in the dark as to what is actually happening within their application that has been containerized when, as a monolith, they understood it completely. And it's just because the orchestration has added an additional layer of complexity for them that they're not familiar with. And because of that, I think the discomfort surrounding containers breeds some insecurity. So, but I don't think it's inherently more or less insecure than any other software.
You know, I might throw one just nuance on that, which is one of the things I see at least is a lot of times there's this team interaction about who owns what and which pieces.
Nailed
and
it.
That adds a huge amount of complexity and risk, because now it's very, very, very often you'll see, oh, that's not mine. This is somebody else's. We found this, but you know, I got to go let this other team know. And anytime you have communication, you have possibilities of it breaking down. So clearly understanding who owns what in this incredibly interdependent environment is one piece that just people seem to be having a lot of trouble with.
Yes.
Pavan, are you seeing the same thing? And if so, since you guys have the observability tools, are people looking at that stuff, and is it just a black box, or how much can I see into these container environments?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of these points are some of the things that we see as well, right? So container security is definitely a team sport, like Jeffrey mentioned, right? Where we see the teams that are playing are the DevOps teams, developers, security teams, right? Like everybody needs to be on the same page about what are these policies that they need to implement, how are these policies going to be checked for in the CI/CD pipeline, at runtime and so on. And then also visibility is a big problem, right? When people are moving to containers and Kubernetes, the number one thing that I hear from containers is, I don't have visibility, right? That's a key problem. And that's really the core of all security issues, right? Where if you don't have that visibility before you can do any sort of detection, right? Remediation, all of that. So really the goal is, how do you get visibility inside containers and understand what are some of the misconfigurations, anomalous activity that might be going on. So really being able to spot those is a visibility problem from what we see.
Hey, Daniel, can you follow up a little bit on that? Because there are so many misconfigurations in the cloud and on the infrastructure and with the containers themselves and the APIs. So is the root of the problem just human error? Is that what's at the cause of this, or is there something more nefarious afoot here that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, no, I think it's again, it's just kind of we don't know what's going on inside the container. We're not familiar with the container environment. We inherited this from somebody else because it was non-cloud native. Now we migrated the application to the cloud, figuring out what software is actually in the application, microservice separation, where is this microservice linked to another one, how's the communication working, how's the networking chain working. All of those things they're complex questions, and if you didn't start with the application and you haven't been at the company for a while, they can be difficult to answer. And with Pavan's, what he said about visibility, that is why Signal Sciences exists, right? If we can try to secure something once we know what's happening. If we don't know what's happening, how can we secure anything? You can't just slap a piece of software in front of something and hope that it's going to work. And with a web application firewall, traditionally, people were front-ending their applications with it. Well, when the container is the application, right, a segmented microservice, it's an application. So you have to get it inside that container, and people have a hard time, in my experience, even getting into their containers to see what's going on and running. So how do you get something else in there?
I mean, I would argue that people needing to get into containers is probably doing it wrong, right? Because if you need to get into a container to understand what's going on, then you probably haven't done that container right.
You absolutely nailed it. But that's the problem that we're faced with, because we get into these environments, and I do the technical implementations, right? So when I'm talking to these guys, my first questions are completely unanswered. Hey, what software are you running within the container environment? Oh, you're containerized. That's a secondary question. Finding out that they're in a container, I don't really care. We're container, we're agnostic to that. It's just a matter of what the software is, right? Because that determines our deployment methodology and configuration. And if they can't answer that question, then we have to actually look at it. Well, what's your code for what's your pom.xml?
I think there's some fairly fundamental changes that that you have to bear in your mind when we talk about this, though. I mean, one is that our workloads and our infrastructure are effectively becoming merged into the same thing, right? I mean, that's the one thing that container orchestration platforms do, is that you end up really not being able to separate out what is my application and what's my infrastructure anymore, right? The same development team built that Docker image. They probably wrote the Kubernetes YAML, and they wrote the application, and the application it never exists without its Docker image, without it being deployed into Kubernetes. So, that's your first big problem space, is that we fundamentally changed the whole concept of what's an application and what's infrastructure. And then, you know, the other gigantic change is really what transition to cloud native is all about, is velocity, right? You know, what's the reason for any organization to move to cloud native is to move quicker, right? And being able to move quicker is what equals business success in the modern era. So, and though that velocity is in some ways, you know, I mean, if we look, for those of us who've been around in computing for you know, a reasonable amount of time, in velocity and change were the things you avoided doing, right? Because that was, you know, that was when bad things happened. You know, let's
do it in
don't
pride.
change anything. And so, you know, what we're really talking about is how do we, you know, adopt new ways of being able to manage things whilst everything is changing all of the time. You know, it's the flying the airplane while we're building the airplane kind of thing, right?
It's interesting though. To me, I think it's part of it has to do with just trust, because you're dependent on these other teams and you have to know that you can depend on them to secure their pieces. And to me, that's the really fascinating kind of new piece. It's always been that way, but you know, if you look at the last 5 years, rise of microservices, containerization, orchestration, infrastructure as code, they all have this theme of you're dependent on more and more other teams, and security has to be dependent on the trust for them to do their pieces right. It can't be layered on after the fact.
Well, let me ask you about that.
Or you sacrifice that speed that you're actually doing all this for.
Well, let me ask you about then all these public registries where these containers are showing up, if we're talking about trust. Am I supposed to trust all these people who created these things and I'm just downloading them, or should I be staying away from these public registries?
I'll take that since I brought up trust. Trust should never be blind. That trust but verify is just true. Fundamentally, I don't think I would want to consume anything from a public registry without knowing in some sort of detailed manner exactly what's in it, what's been done to be secure about it, how was it developed, and what was the risk profile they developed underneath.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, look, you know, there's best practice already in that area, right? And the best practice is always going to be that you build that container image yourself as part of your software development lifecycle. You know, whether that best practice is actually general practice in the industry is a completely different question. But I mean, you know, you look at the survey results from stuff Sneak did in this space and others have done around, you know, vulnerabilities in images in public registries is gigantic, right? You know, but that's the nature of those kind of things. And I think that you know, that is changing in terms of people's perceptions of what, you know, how they ought to develop container images. So I think that is starting to change, and I suspect we'll see less of that consumption from public registries as more and more people realize the right way to do this.
Yeah, and I think that this is a good point where a lot of times when I talk to customers, the first use case they want to address is image scanning, right? This is the core component of making sure you're scanning your images in the pipeline, right? Sitting in your registry, as Jeffrey mentioned, right? And talking about statistics, one of the key, you know, interesting insights we found was, you know, for when it comes to OS vulnerabilities, you know, a lot of times developers are doing a great job at scanning for those, but the area where a lot of them are missing is the non-OS vulnerabilities, where, you know, over 50% of images or non-OS packages have high or critical CVEs, right? That's a big number, right? Where your developer might be pulling, you know, Python pip or Java jar and these other packages where they might not be scanning for them, but they are introducing vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah,
in those
I mean, you know, obviously, I think at least two of us in this room, you know, work in that space, right? So I think you're preaching to the converted here. But yeah, I mean, you know, it's surprising how many people aren't doing just basic stuff like that, right? Dependency scanning for upstream vulnerabilities. I mean, you know, what is an application these days? It's a tiny percentage of homegrown code and open source packages in almost every ecosystem. And, you know, I mean, I don't think open source code is necessarily getting more insecure, but we're just using more of it, right? There's more of it out there, and therefore you're going to get more opportunities for things to be insecure. So scanning third-party, upstream packages is a critical part of that. But then you've got the problem of compiled languages, though, right? As well. I mean, in the cloud native ecosystem, goes the cool kid's choice, and how do you start looking at vulnerabilities in compiled languages is much more complicated.
And it's a challenge. I mean, if you're looking at the application owners, what they're faced with is really a difficult balance. And security always is a balancing act between the needs of the business and productivity and actual security. I mean, everybody always says, right? You want to secure, to pull the plug, right? That's the only quick way you're going to get to it. And when you're talking about these public registries and repos, telling people you can't leverage the convenience of these and be secure is a tough balancing act. Like, so for example, Signal Sciences, we provide our own container image for our agent, right? So that people can just pull it straight from Docker Hub and put it into their environment. Now, is that desirable for them to just take our word for it? Sure, it doesn't have any vulnerabilities. There's no insecure code in there. Of course, we vetted every single one of these 2 million lines of code or whatever. But they look at us for help, for visibility, and to secure their applications. And ultimately, what we're telling them is, hey, I know that you're looking for this, but you need to take this image and you need to look at it, and you need to make sure that what we're providing you actually is secure. And even then, it's going to be updated regularly because we're talking DevSec. This is fast. This is going to be done. Hey, that image you just verified, by the way, there's an update now.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another one of those challenges where you start to get into if you're kind of wave zero early adopter of cloud native stuff, you're likely to have very high development velocity. Your containers are being redeployed all the time, right? So you are getting, just by the nature of your workflow, you're tending to have that update happening, where I've updated to a new container, a new base image, or I've updated my own code. So I've got those containers churning in production. But there was some scary statistic I saw the other day about how many people how much people were actually looking at containers they've already got in production. And it was a massive proportion of people just go, oh yeah, we don't worry about those. Well, why?
Let me ask you about that specifically, because it has been on my mind. I'm kind of curious how you guys think it's practical to shift all this responsibility further left to developers, because if I understand the process, I'm supposed to scan my code while I'm writing it. Then I got to scan the runtime before I put it on there. Then I got to scan the host to make sure that that is secure. And then if there's any new vulnerabilities added to my application later on, I got to go rescan everything to find that because somebody discovered some new vulnerability. And at what point do I run out of time while I'm doing all that to not write any new code? I mean, at some point, developers sit there and go, I'm babysitting all my container applications, so I don't have time to actually go build another one and babysit that one. So
I mean, this is why we need
of doing this.
We need automation in that. You can't do this properly without having automation in there. So if you're doing those things manually, then that's probably not a good plan. And it's about providing the tooling that gives the folks who are now responsible for it. And I mean, it's not like the industry's saying it must be developers who do this, right? This is just evolved as working practice that in cloud native environments, we're looking much more across functional teams, and those responsibilities naturally evolve into those areas. So I think what we've got to do as an industry is certainly something that we're focused on at Snake is providing tools that give people that visibility without, in the most friction-free way. So, surfacing the things that you need to know about early and often within exactly the workflow that you're going to use all the time. So if we're talking about the start of that development process, things like IDE integrations, just stuff that makes it super easy for folks to see that. And then, the same with integrating into things like GitHub, integrating into CI/CD, and integrating into monitoring systems. That's when you look at the people who are doing this well, that's what they're doing, is they're taking all of these integration points and they're putting high levels of automation around there so that the right information is being surfaced to people, and I think we touched on this right at the start of this conversation, that, visibility is the absolute key to this stuff, but it's also knowing where to look, right? So
yeah, I might even add on that. Automation is important in, detecting and identifying, what's in each container, for example, is essential. But I actually think the biggest slowdown to development cycles is actually the remediation. It's the fixing. And anything you can do to actually automate, I mean, we've put a lot of focus on remediating in a more automated way, but fundamentally it's a prioritization problem. And so being able to present insights, this is more important than the other piece, making sure it gets routed to the right team, building the processes is actually just as important as automation. And a lot of that's cultural, and a lot of that has to do with people's, realms of ownership. But fundamentally, you need to be able to not just find out what's wrong, but somehow prioritize and fix those things in a really, really automated, quick way. And it's not an easy task. It's just not.
And what you just, okay, so this is exactly why tools like Signal Sciences exist, right? So, and many others. You have to have a tool that allows you to make changes, to patch vulnerabilities, or to push out a rule set that can address a vulnerability in code that was figured out, today or 5 minutes ago, without having to put it on the software developer to go back and fix it instantly and do all this. Providing them with the tool to a security team to say, listen, hey guys, you're aware of the vulnerability. You don't have to wait for it to be patched. Let's handle it here with this tool, right, in the cloud, and that rule set's going to be pushed down. It's going to start being done immediately, and then provide the visibility to your development team so that they know how to fix it moving forward. But the impetus isn't on them. The burden isn't on them to get this done right now, right? Because we've already got it done. We're using a tool to patch this vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And honestly, if we step back and just think about how we tie all these together, right, to answer Mike's question, one of the things that we believe at Sysdig is security is something that's embedded across the container lifecycle, right? So a lot of things we talked about, in the build phase, are you scanning for these vulnerabilities, but also at runtime, right? What can you detect at runtime when your container is running? Did someone spawn a terminal shell? Did someone, write below a directory? Like, having the ability to detect runtime threats is important. And then tying it into the remediation incident response side, where containers are ephemeral. We all know that, right? On average, one of the things we found was on average a container lives less than 5 minutes, right? So that opens the door for a lot, container breaches to occur. So really having a plan for incident response and forensics is important. And earlier we talked about visibility. We talked about container security being a team sport. Really, here the teams that are playing in the build are the developers, and making sure that the security plays well with them. Right? At runtime, it's really the cloud teams and DevOps teams that are applying these policies at runtime. So playing nicely with them is important. And on the remediation side, working with your incident response teams, other specific development teams, and making sure that they have a process in place and a framework really to respond to an incident when it does occur in an automated and quick way is really the way to address it across this life cycle, right? So at Sysdig, that's one of the key beliefs, and how we address container security is really across those key, 3 pillars in the life cycle.
It's an interesting viewpoint you just brought up, because to me, I've always thought of container security as failing, or the problems people often face fall into one of 2 categories. One is they treat it exactly like their application code, and they fail to take into account all of the things like different team ownership and, base layers versus writable layers and all those, the more network security pieces, they just treat it like application code, and it's not. And then the other group is people who treat it like it's not application code, like it's some sort of network thing, and they only focus on that end. I think the number one piece of advice I more or less end up giving everybody is you have to treat it like application code with its own specialty items. You can't put it into one of your existing buckets. If you're adopting containers, they aren't you can't just take your application policies and apply them, and you can't just take your network policies and apply them. It's both.
Which is why simplicity of rule sets and tools directly in the CI/CD pipeline is necessary for this to be done.
Yeah,
it's got to be native.
I think we're going to start seeing a lot more focus on compliance testing, on automated compliance testing. It's surprising how few people are doing that in anger in the Kubernetes world yet, even though the tooling exists to do it. So I definitely think we're going to start to see a growth in that as people understand. I mean, ultimately, one of the biggest risks in container platforms is really misconfiguration, right? I mean, exploits in code, that's always been around. We understand that, right? Software's always been exploitable, but the new thing is that in combination with where we've merged the workload and the infrastructure together so much. So there's so many potential things for people to misunderstand about how applications should be configured. We've got to build automated gates in there to say, this doesn't get into the cluster unless you're not running as root or whatever.
Yeah, human error is always the number one security concern, right? I mean, a lot more people leave the door unlocked than have faulty door locks.
Yeah. And a lot of those people
That's a good analogy. Yeah, I like that.
And a lot of those people assume that their neighborhood's safe, right?
But wasn't all that a problem before we had containers? I mean, the same issue existed with monolithic applications. Just
People
sounds
haven't
like
changed.
A lot more opportunities to leave the door open.
We haven't improved humans yet, so yeah.
Exactly. That's pretty much what it is.
If this is the case, then will this shift to containers force people, I guess I'll direct this to Matt, to adopt best DevSecOps processes? We talk a lot about DevSecOps, but I don't know if a lot of people are doing it just yet. And if so, is there an automation gap that needs to be filled, or do we have enough automation to accomplish this, Matt?
Well, there's quite a few questions in there. I think I'm just mentally trying to unpick them. Well, I mean, so the DevSecOps thing, I mean, I think, in some ways, as we were talking about briefly before we came on air, I think we're still kind of codifying what that really means in practice, right? I mean, I suspect what's going on at the minute when a lot of folks say the word DevSecOps is like what happened at the start of DevOps, right? That all of a sudden, one minute I'm a Linux administrator and the next minute I'm a DevOps engineer, and all that means is someone just decided I had that responsibility. So I suspect there's a little bit of that in the industry at the minute, in terms of buzzwords. But the basic principle of that, in terms of this shift left of high levels of automation around security, I think we are that is definitely where the direction that we need to go in, right? I think it's pretty much. I don't think there's much disagreement in the industry about the things that are important for us to focus on in terms of, Git-driven, cloud-native app development, right? I think, it's not like we don't all understand, at least at a high level, where the touch points are and what we need to do there. I think it's just getting the taking the rest of the industry there, and I think definitely in the last 12 months we've started to see a much more wider agreement, amongst folks about the best practice. Certainly in my community, in the cloud native community, the CNCF white paper that was released recently was fairly definitive, in terms of where the things are that we need to consider. So that was a slightly rambling answer to that question, I hope.
Daniel, let me follow up with you on that same question with a little extra nuance, though. So what exactly is the job of a security person if the developers are shifting everything left, and what is their role in this whole DevSecOps world that we're talking about?
Man, as a security professional, I would love to say, man, our job is just to sit here and relax and drink coffee, but unfortunately that is not the case. No, it really should be always. So the security practitioner is always going to have to be focused on two things, right? In my opinion, of course, the first of those is making sure that the needs of the business are being served, right? So what are those needs? What is the level of risk that the business is accepting and unaware of, right? And then try to illuminate what those gaps are. And then the second one is going to be providing the rest of the teams with the tools that they need to get things secure. And whether that's knowledge or a security tool that needs to be acquired or deployment of that security tool effectively, right? All of those things are resourcing that the business is going to be counting on the security professional to provide. So the expertise is big, right? Because how do we expect a software developer to have to know, oh, hey, here are all the latest CVEs. Oh, here's how you have to know this stuff before we provide you visibility. No, we have to give them the visibility, right, into their applications. If we want to tell them they need to secure their WebSocket communication, we need to provide them with a tool that will allow them visibility into WebSocket communication and between their applications or their containers. And then we need to provide them with the means to secure that outside of just coding. So all of those definitely keep us busy.
Pavan, let me ask you a similar question just a little further down. Can we get past this somewhat historical tension between the app dev people and the security people that's existed, where the developers are always like, you guys show up with your spreadsheet full of vulnerabilities and you don't tell me which one of these is more important than the next one. So I basically stare at it, and if I have a few minutes, I might look at one or two of them, but I got other things I'm trying to do. And the security guys tend to look at the developers as the root cause of the problem, because if they were securing the code in the first place, they wouldn't have to go do all the things Daniel just described. So, how do we make all this come together?
This is a fantastic question, because literally I was talking to a customer last week and they said the same thing, which is, I have 100 vulnerabilities, but what do I do with them? And the problem there, the fundamental question is about priority, right? So how do you prioritize these vulnerabilities? And that's where, when your microservice is now broken down into multiple different services, the boundary changes, right? The new application boundary requires a deep understanding of Kubernetes and the cloud environment. So it's really the context from the runtime environment that defines those precise policies that you must implement in order to take action, right? So for example, if you detect a vulnerability in a running image in a sensitive PCI scope namespace, right, in Kubernetes, that has a different priority and remediation plan than an image running in a dev cluster, right? So how do you first figure out where those vulnerabilities are, which applications that are sensitive are exposed, and finally, which team owns that fix, right? So that last mile of coverage is really important. And that's one of the things that at Sysdig, we help bridge that gap, where it's not just, here you go, you have a list of 1,000 vulnerabilities, Mr. Developer, you figure it out. But no, let's help you prioritize with the runtime context that you need to better put together a plan that the security and the DevOps teams can be on the same page about.
All right, Jeffrey, do you think there'll be some kumbaya moments in our future? Come on.
So I think the last sentence he said is the most important, which is that they can agree about. And when you already have the problem, it's too late to reach an agreement about it. You have to start at the beginning. When you actually start implementing these tools, you have to determine what your prioritization is going to be. And we all have different ways of doing it, right? We have a technology that tells you whether you're reaching a vulnerable method, and that could be a piece of it. You have other pieces like what business function does this serve? Like, Pawan, you just said. Fundamentally, though, I do think it's getting better. I honestly think the people coming out now, people starting in new teams, new product teams, they tend to have their heads screwed on a little bit straighter here. That scenario you just described of security just handing a spreadsheet over and say, you deal with it, is what I would call bad security management.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's not any different than any other kind of bad management. Slowly, people who do it poorly get run out. And that's easier at the beginning of a maturity cycle, like security, especially in containers, has been. And as time goes on, the good ones get weeded out and selected. So I hate saying survival of the fittest. It sounds like I'm preaching evolution, but that's really what this is. It's an evolution that I think we're actually getting farther along. It's not 3 years ago. It's not 4 years ago. People understand the business value of security, and they understand the importance of working together as a team. And I think it's changing. Not everywhere, not at the same speed, but as an industry, it's getting better.
I had an interesting quote a few weeks ago from one of the speakers at SneakCon, that the security role in folks who are effectively implementing DevSecOps and cloud native workflows is transitioning from being the old kind of gatekeeper idea to being toolsmiths and advisors. And I thought that was kind of quite a well put phrasing for how that, for the kind of transition that we're going through in this space.
Much better than I put it, but that's exactly what I was getting at.
Yeah, I mean, it boils down to enablement of some kind and and setting up that risk management that you talked about, Daniel, I think was really important. They have the knowledge to be able to effectively analyze risk, and an average developer does not. I think that's fair.
They also have the job role.
Yeah.
Right. And you put it very clearly. It is lazy security, right? That says, hey, you know what? Here's a list of vulnerabilities, just handle. No, the security team should be doing far more to enable the business than that. Right?
And we've seen this before, which is the fun part for me. I originally cut my teeth in software quality, and it used to be quality would be handing it back over. Here's a list of bugs, go fix them without any further context. And things got better and it got more mature and it collapsed. Performance, same thing. So I think in general, we have a bright future in container security specifically, but security in general of people working together better. I think the wrinkle containers throws in is really, it changes the structure of the team so much, and there's so much interdependence that it can become very hard to route the problems for resolution. And it can become very hard to understand what you trust and what you don't.
Jeffrey,
and a lot of times I feel like teams need the help, right? Where a lot of times in these environments, they don't have anything today, right? And what do you do at that point? Is really, it's totally new for them. So really having tools like you guys are describing that help bridge that gap, help them understand the context of a vulnerability to help them prioritize better, alleviates a lot of this, right? Ultimately saving them time, which is the key benefit here, so that they can ship apps faster, right? That's the ultimate goal for all these DevOps teams.
Jeffrey, let me follow up on what you just said though. Is security therefore going to become part of the QA process, since you were doing all that testing back then? And is it today in the wrong place and it needs to be part of that quality assurance motion?
I'm laughing because I literally ran across a guy. I was talking to him. His title was DevSec QA Ops Engineer. And I was like, that's a developer. I don't know what to tell you. You can't just throw all of the things in one title. At some point, shortening it becomes longer. Yeah, ultimately, everything we do is around the realm rather of risk management. And there's all these different avenues of risks, of which security is a major one because the impact is so huge. But in all honesty, Daniel was really right to keep pointing back to business value. We're supposed to be going quicker. We have to go quicker without having decreases in quality, without having decreases in security. And we live in a world where security needs are growing, not decreasing. And we also live in a world where quality needs are actually decreasing because you're basically using other people's components most of the time, which you can kind of trust work. So, as Matt pointed out earlier, people are writing less proprietary code. So fundamentally, yeah, these roles will collapse into each other. And I think we have a future of performance and security being what Daniel pointed out. Hey, I'm here as the expert. I'm going to give you the tools. I'm going to select the right pieces to help you out in your job, but I'm just a resource. And my main role is really making sure that we categorize the risk correctly for my area of expertise and giving you the tools to actually be able to address that risk.
All right, so Pavan, let me follow up with you then about how is this necessarily going to work? Because if I have more of these containers, they're more ephemeral, they're being ripped and replaced, that means more things are generating alerts, right? I'm getting all these alerts and there's more alert fatigue because there's more moving parts. So how do I take all these quote unquote signals and pull that into something that's actionable? Or am I just going to get overwhelmed with even more alerts that I'm already complaining about in the monolithic world?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think a lot of times we see this, with runtime, especially at runtime, where you may be generating a ton of alerts from multiple different tools, and one of the things that we've seen getting well adopted is open source tools like Falco. Right? Falco is something that we created and donated to the CNCF. It's a runtime security engine for containers and Kubernetes. And one of the nice things with Falco is, you can really define very precise policies using, specific Kubernetes metadata or your container metadata to really, reduce the number of alerts you might be getting. And that helps the teams that are using open source tools like Falco to really filter out the noise and improve that signal to noise ratio, right? With that context, with the metadata. And then really having the response framework be automated, right? So with Falco, you can just configure DIY webhooks to alert, via PagerDuty or Slack or other tools to ensure that your developers are responding to those alerts when they do matter, right? And that's the most important thing. You want to make sure that your teams are not drowning in the noise and are able to kind of understand what those problems are. And then tying it back to that security, and kind of DevOps on the same page, one of the things with Falco is we're trying to make it easier for security teams to understand those alerts, because a lot of times if a SOC team sees that alert, they might not understand what it is. So we've mapped it, for example, to the MITRE attack framework, right? So you have different categories in the MITRE framework, like lateral movement, exfiltration. So really tagging those Falco rules now for a SOC team who may not understand Kubernetes well enough, understands what a privilege escalation is and knows potentially how to respond to that, right? So really bridging that gap for the workflows that work for them on their, security for on-prem workloads and mapping them for their container environments is a big benefit to improve the signal to noise, better classification, and response.
Daniel, you agree with that? Are you seeing the same thing?
Man, I'm trying to let other people talk, but yes, I have a million thoughts on that. First of all, I love what Pavan just said about having a good framework that helps you identify these things. From my perspective, so my title's actually changed recently, but what I'm doing is the same. So account manager, whatever, technical account manager. I am on a weekly basis, I'm talking to these enterprise customers and their security teams and their dev teams. I'm talking to all the teams at once, right? We'll bring them into the same call. Sometimes we'll have separate calls, and then I have to link the pieces together. Ultimately, what I'm finding is there is a knowledge gap, and And that knowledge gap can be technological or it can be methodological. And I think that when you have the tools in place, everything's in your CI/CD pipeline. You've got the tools providing you with all these alerting and visibility and graphs and all this data going to your SIEMs, whatever. You have to know where to prioritize. And I have people asking me, which it's always funny to me when people come to you, you've got this team of people who've been in security for 30 years, and it's a humbling experience when they ask you, where should we be focusing? We see all this data that's coming in, but what do we do with it? How do we know what's a priority? How do we know this is an attack versus a scanning tool or a, or is it just a red herring? I mean, is there anything of everything that we're seeing of these multi-billion, events, alerts, whatever, that we should focus on because we have to prioritize? Having a framework helps you do that. And then being from the security advisor side of things, you have to be aware of what you're seeing. And I have all these customers coming to me and they're all asking, what is everybody else doing, right? Everybody's asking what everybody else is doing, right? And the question should be more along the lines of, what is a best practice for us, right? What is our organization struggling with? How are we being attacked? Where is our critical data? Where are the avenues of approach for attackers? Not just what are vulnerabilities, but do these vulnerabilities even matter? Is this application housing data that we care about? And from the security side of things, if you can help prioritization, and again, going back to risk management, you can give people what they need to start, to provide a baseline of where to approach container or any other type of security. And then once they can start with that baseline, they know where to start looking in their tools. And they know once they get the framework in mind, they can start enhancing their own security far beyond what I could ever do for them, because I don't work at that organization. I don't own the application. I just know basic security practices that I can provide them a starting point and the visibility with the tool that we offer. Once they have that in place, they can get the confidence that they need to work with one of these frameworks and enhance the security of their organization.
So Matt, what kind of vulnerabilities are you seeing? Because I talk to some folks and they're a little skeptical and they look at the reports and they see, 90% of these things are cryptojacking, and they look at it and they go, well, that's a victimless crime. Let's just move on, and we don't take it too seriously. So what type of vulnerabilities should people be looking for?
Well, I mean, you've definitely got some of those things that are just around misconfiguration. You talk about the crypto miner stuff. That was a big thing over the last 12 months. Kubernetes clusters open to the internet. Unauthenticated API endpoints where anybody can go and start spinning up workloads on your cluster. And you can say that's a victimless crime, but then you start to get into the realms of denial of service, and then there's all sorts of other things that you're capable of doing once you can control resources that are on that particular cluster. So I think definitely those misconfiguration. If you look at some of the big hacks that have happened over the last 12 months, they've been a combination of both misconfigurations and exploits, because that's the real dangerous ground where you've managed to get in through exploiting vulnerable code, but then you're in a situation where that particular piece of infrastructure is misconfigured, and then you're into truly terrible category breaches, with the horror stories of tens of millions of user data being breached have almost all been a combination of those things. So I think you've got to look at it holistically, really.
Jeffrey, do you think it's only a matter of time before something catastrophic happens, or did it already happen and we're just not talking about it?
Yeah, it's already happened. And also, I'm convinced that just I would be surprised if there haven't been major breaches that just nobody knows about. But look, I mean, to go back to the other one, the most dangerous failures, the most dangerous vulnerabilities tend to be the ones that break the trust boundary. And classic examples being cross-site scripting, right? That's more dangerous in containers, I feel, than just in general, because you're depending on so much of this is on the infrastructure level, and you have no choice but to trust certain pieces. So knowing what you have on the infrastructure and knowing how you trust it and how you actually interact with it is a very, very important piece to focus on. I do think, though, in all honesty, where it's a matter of time before there's a major breach somewhere that is going to be, in the news and regular people hear about it. There's too much software in the world, and too much of it's getting containerized and put into big infrastructures with multiple layers of dependencies, and we're all depending on somebody who depends on somebody who depends on somebody else. It's only a matter of time before something large scale happens because one of our major infrastructure pieces has a vulnerability that wasn't patched.
So what's the opposite of zero trust? It's 100% trust. Is that where we are now?
I mean, well, the problem is trust takes time, and we live in a world where velocity is king. And you can even see it in things like how fast we adopt new technologies. But fundamentally, that's happening at the same time. There's a massive explosion of software everywhere. I mean, fundamentally, sooner or later, somebody somewhere is going to hack a Docker container that's running a car, and that's the world we're going to be moving into. Security not only isn't not going anywhere, it's going to be more important, I think, than most other areas of software development.
Pavan, let me ask you, you mentioned this in passing, but maybe you could get into it a little bit more, but do we need to really have something that feels like continuous testing, and can we do that where everything is in motion? If everything is dynamic, then the testing itself needs to be on all the time, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that is definitely what we're all kind of advocating for, is automation and continuous testing. And it's almost CI, CD, CS, right? It's continuous security as part of that, right? As another buzzword to add on to the jargon here.
Hold on, nobody's mentioned security by design yet. We got another buzzword we got to throw in.
We checked off zero trust. We checked off, so we got all of them now. But jokes aside, I think it's a true phenomenon, right? Where I think that is where the industry is moving as containers start to get more and more adopted in production and more real, more important use cases. I think security cannot be a blocker anymore, and has to be part of the whole deployment process, right? In the build, at runtime. And I think it's interesting, to kind of what Jeff was mentioning, and Matt as well, where a lot of these security use cases that I'm hearing are the same ones that I heard 10 years ago. Like, vulnerability management is still important in containers, right? Intrusion detection is still important in containers. Forensics. So what's interesting is in the past you had all these use cases, but you had different tools to do them. Containers are actually a forcing function to bring all of these together, and now the teams have to think about these all together, right? And that's the crux of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
It's like, how do you address this? And you have knowledge gaps, to Daniel's point, right? You have workflow gaps, and you have tool gaps, right? Which all need to be addressed almost at the same time as these containers are not starting to pick up in real deployments, right? So that's really why continuous security needs to become an important, testament to every kind of DevSecOps philosophy, right? As you apply this in your environments.
And to what everybody just said there, one other thing that I get people questioning all the time, from the trust standpoint and from the tooling standpoint, is, are we securing, or do we even need to think about securing our traffic between our containers, between our services? And the answer is, yeah, you do, absolutely. But it's a challenge, and again, finding the right tool to do that, and then also acknowledging the risk. Getting people, I mean, when I have this many people at very big companies that have huge amounts of cloud infrastructure, All of their applications are in the cloud, and they're asking me, hey, do we need to worry about the communication between our, our authentication service over here and our backend database service over here, because they're both in the container space? Can we just secure one of them, or can we just secure ingress? And the answer is no. You need to secure your ingress, and you need to secure between your containers as well. But that's a challenge, and getting people to even acknowledge it at this stage is even a bigger challenge, I think.
I'm going to come to Pavan here for one last thing, though. Do we need something that feels like the Ronald Reagan doctrine for container security, where it's trust but verify somehow or other? And if so, what's the observability to track whether or not the quote unquote treaty we just made is actually being adhered to?
Yeah, I think the trust but verify, zero trust, these philosophies need to be implemented, right, in the container environment. And I think it's a great opportunity, because when you define trust, it's really across the pipeline, it's runtime, it's everywhere, right, wherever the containers are, depending on their stage in the life cycle. So it's a great way to think about it, is kind of our belief. And then applying them really allows you to be thoughtful of defining that least privilege, right? How should this workload run? What are the governance, compliance, security policies that this image must meet in order to run, right? So all of these are great ways to think about zero trust, and then validating that in production and making sure that it's following that, and if it's not, taking the right action, right? So really the trust but verify model, I think, works really, really nicely if you have the right set of policies that are agreed upon, again, right, from security, from the DevOps team. So you have that process in place.
All right, guys. I think we're going to shift over here to hand out some Amazon gift cards at this point. Our winners are today Carl M, Tom W, Ryan C, and Amy F. I want to thank our panelists today for sharing their knowledge and their insights. I didn't think I'd be having so much fun talking about container security today, but I did enjoy myself. Guys, you did an awesome job. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Hey, thank you.
Pleasure.
Fun time, anytime.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys.
All right. And we'll see you all next time. And by all means, come check out another webinar.
Right on. Bye, guys.
Take care.